Good evening, how are you doing? Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here on this rainy afternoon. My name is Kevin Modernism. I'm the Ryan Chair of Women's Studies here at Duquesne University and the Executive Director of the National Institute for Newman Studies in Oakland. The National Institute for Newman Studies endeavors to foster scholarship on John Henry Carter Newman's life and teachings. In addition to having the most comprehensive book and digital library collection of Newman's works, the Institute also offers interested Newman scholars from around the world who would like to come to Pittsburgh the opportunity to come and live in our library and research and write here. We also sponsor occasional lectures, such as the one we're gathered here this evening. This evening's lecture is also co-sponsored by the McNulty College and Graduate School of Liberal Arts at Duquesne University. And I'd like to thank Dean Jim Swindoll for all of his support and assistance in making this lecture possible. Tonight's lecture is the third annual Newman Legacy Lecture. The Newman Legacy Lecture was instituted by the Newman Institute and Duquesne to bring to campus scholars of first rank whose scholarship has been influenced by their study of John Henry Newman. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Brad S. Gregory. Dr. Gregory is the Dorothy G. Griffin Professor of Early Modern European History in the Department of History at the University of Notre Dame. He has been awarded the Height Prize in Humanities and the Cato Teaching Award from Notre Dame. His principal research interests include Christianity in the Reformation era and the methodology and theory and the understanding of religion and history. He is the author of many influential books, including Reforming the Reformation and The Unintended Reformation, How a Religious Revolution Secularized Society. It was in the process of my reading of this latter book, The Unintended Reformation, that I began to sense that Dr. Gregory's interpretation of the various trajectories of Western culture and society in the wake of the Reformation seemed to have much in common with Newman's own thinking and interpretation of the same historical events and their meaning. Newman's own connecting of the Reformation and the rise of what he called liberalism in religion, and the establishment of what he also called the anti-dogmatic principle in modern high culture, seem to have pretty much in common with Dr. Gregory's thesis in the book, The Unintended Reformation.
Newman wrote in his autobiography, The Apologia Pro Vita Sua, he quotes himself in his biography. He had written a letter to a Protestant friend about 10 years before his conversion to Catholicism. He wrote in his letter, Newman wrote, "Are you aware that the more serious thinkers among us regard the spirit of liberalism as the characteristic of the destined Antichrist?" Antichrist, Newman continues, is described as anomos, as exalting himself above the yoke of religion and law. The spirit of lawlessness came in with the Reformation, and liberalism is its offspring. Unquote. That's from Newman's autobiography. I kept thinking of passages from Newman like this as I was reading Dr. Gregory's book. His own arguments about the Reformation, giving rise to various phenomena that he calls hyperpluralism and the kingdom of whatever, struck me as echoing Newman's own concerns about the lawlessness and anarchy that resulted in many ways from a religious tradition that so strongly emphasized iconoclasm and protest. So I contacted Dr. Gregory and I asked him about my perception that his work was, as a historian, had many similarities with Newman's reflections on the history of European culture since the Reformation. He very graciously responded to my letter, and he wrote the following to me. "You're quite correct." It's fine. You said, "You're quite correct. There is a similarity between my view of the Reformation and Newman's. Although I'm certainly not a Newman scholar or a specialist, I have been reading Newman for many years, and he has had a deep influence on me." So intrigued to know more, I invited Dr. Gregory to come to the Newman Institute and Duquesne to talk to us about the influence of Newman on his work as a historian. And to my delight, he accepted the invitation. And we are extremely fortunate this evening to have him with us. The title of his talk is The Prophetic Newman. Let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Brad Gregory.
I always try to sit close enough to the podium so that I can make it up before the applause dies down. Because otherwise, there's this really awkward moment where you're still walking and nobody's clapping anymore. Thank you very much, Kevin, for the very kind introduction. It's embarrassing in a way because I hadn't realized exactly what I didn't remember exactly what I wrote in that email, but it's almost exactly what I'm going to say in just a few lines here by way of introduction. Thanks very much for being here. I remember how struck I was in graduate school when a fellow student, a modern European intellectual historian of great learning and ability, told me, "Cardinal Newman saved my life." He explained that Newman had led him back to the Catholicism in which he'd been raised and which he had cast off for some years when he started in high school to read modern German philosophy and became what he thought was sophisticated. He's not the only one who said something similar to me. Now comes the part where I'm channeling my email. I'm not a Newman scholar, but I have read Newman for years, and the power of his writings has also influenced me in crucial ways. I refer to Newman in the final chapter of my recent book, The Unintended Reformation, and that book's argument about the complex and continuing effects of the Reformation era on the modern Western world is indebted to Newman's ideas and inspiration. I'm grateful to Dr. Kevin Mongrain for his invitation to deliver the 2014 Newman Legacy Lecture. Whatever trepidation I may feel, and I do feel it, about doing so among specialists at the National Institute for Newman Studies. Whence Newman's power? Why does he remain such an arresting thinker for so many people today? I've organized my reflections around the rubric, as you just heard, the prophetic Newman. Now, Newman might be considered prophetic in any number of different ways. Perhaps the most obvious is one that many scholars have analyzed, namely his ecclesial impact on Catholic theology, with his argument about the development of doctrine, for example, or in raising questions about the laity's role in the church, both of which influenced the Second Vatican Council. Newman's philosophical explication of the relationship between faith and reason, too, in his Grammar of Assent, proved prescient in breaking with post-Enlightenment rationalism in a manner that prefigured aspects of the thought of the later Wittgenstein, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and Alistair MacIntyre. Interesting and important as these influences are, however, I'm going to pursue a different sense in which Newman was prophetic this evening. My concern is with the ethos of Western society and culture, and thus with John Henry Newman as a discerning social and cultural critic. My basic claim is that Newman saw with uncanny clarity the leading first principles, as he often called them, that animated the English and, more broadly, the European society in the Victorian era, as well as the cultural priorities and behavioral trends that issued from those principles. He grasped the underlying assumptions held and acted on by large numbers of people across England's conspicuous class divisions. Seeing these principles, therefore, allowed a careful observer, which Newman was, to explain a wide range of different behaviors by large numbers of persons with reference to a common commitment. These first principles were, in Newman's estimation, antithetical to Catholic Christianity, and therefore, after his conversion in 1845, antithetical to truth, despite the fact that their protagonists embraced and promoted them as true. At the heart of Newman's assessment of the society and culture of his own day, then, after his conversion, is a sharp contrast between Roman Catholicism and not simply his former Anglicanism or even Protestantism, but between Catholicism and the wider culture, including Catholics, to the extent that their de facto allegiances lay more with the wider society's animating principles than with the principles of their own church. Newman's fundamental conceptualization of modern society is agonistic and conflictual in ways that repeatedly echo the biblical opposition between the gospel and the world, but it is particularized with respect to the 19th century cultural milieu and its dramatic changes through which he lived during his long life. There is but one real antagonist of the world, and that is the faith of Catholics, he wrote in 1849. The first principles that Newman discerned as already dominant in mid-19th century Britain remain those that are presupposed, politically protected, and culturally reinforced at every turn in Western societies in the early 21st century. An acute observer, Newman understood the most advanced, industrializing, urbanizing society of his own day, the England in which he lived, and the direction in which it was trending. We are still moving along the same fundamental trajectory and according to the same basic principles that Newman grasped, albeit within a built environment and in a technological milieu dramatically different from that of Victorian Britain. Those principles have now spread throughout the world, especially through the influence of the United States. Hence, Newman's insights have proven as prophetic for our time as they were powerful in his own. Recognizing this helps, I think, to account for the abiding appeal and the applicability of Newman's thought a century and a quarter after his death. How many times in reading Newman are you startled by a sense that he seems to be describing our world as well as his? So much then by way of introduction and the sense in which I'm concerned with the prophetic Newman. What Newman saw and what made him no less prophetic with respect to postmodernity than he was insightful as a diagnostician of modernity is the centrality of the sovereign individual self, exercising his or her own will and employing his or her reason or not in whatever ways he or she pleases. In the remainder of my talk, I will first discuss this basic notion and then consider 4 different manifestations of it in Newman's thought. Because of the stark contrast between this preferential individualism and the Christianity he inhabited so deeply, Newman discerned that it was the key to understanding the tectonic changes through which he was living. What he originally approached through categories such as the principle of private judgment and the principle of liberalism, understood initially in narrower theological contexts, he came to see as informing a much wider swath of modern English life. He saw at work an extension of principles that had first been implicit in the Protestant Reformation, but which by the 19th century had been made explicit and come to influence culture and society much more broadly. In other words, in 19th century Britain, it was not simply that Presbyterians, Methodists, or various sorts of dissenting Protestants claimed the right of private judgment to interpret Scripture for themselves, but also that that principle had been generalized and was being applied outside of specifically religious contexts. The right of private judgment was an expandable, protean principle, applicable to much more than biblical interpretation. Liberalism, too, Newman saw as having started in England as one sort of thing, but which had changed over time and gained a wider compass with unanticipated effects. As he put it in his autobiography, the liberalism which gives a color to society now is very different from the character of thought which bore that name 30 or 40 years ago. Now it is scarcely a party, it is the educated lay world. What began with the romantic literary journal established by Shelley and Byron in 1822 later became the appellation of a theological party. This in turn proved dangerous as opening the door to evils which it did not itself either anticipate or comprehend, including eventually the broadest transformation of liberalism into that deep, plausible skepticism, the development of human reason as practically exercised by the natural man. Newman's awareness of the changes he was living through enabled him to see how the emphasis on individual autonomy corroded institutions, customs, values, and faith. All the while, this principle was being trumpeted under the ubiquitous 19th century banners of freedom and progress, as articulated, for example, by Newman's paradigmatic and influential contemporary, John Stuart Mill. The individual self seeking to fulfill his or her own desires, whatever they happen to be, is no less characteristic of the United States in the early 21st century than it was of Britain in the mid-19th. To be sure, an enormous amount has changed between then and there and now and here. But changes in institutions, laws, and dominant cultural norms have moved in the same direction, along the same lines, and in a manner consistent with what Newman saw. The preferential self-determination of individuals has become more pervasive than it was in Victorian Britain, which remained an acutely stratified class society with an established Anglican church, both of which constituted part of the frame of reference within which Newman worked and wrote. Even then, in the 1830s and 40s, the United States lacked such brakes on individualism, the emphasis on which was already more evident than in Britain. The U.S., of course, never had an established church and had instead institutionalized, as it were, the principle of private judgment in religious matters via the First Amendment to the Constitution. This individualism was one of the features of American culture that so struck Tocqueville when he visited the United States in 1831. Emerson touted it iconically a decade later in his essay, Self-Reliance. Insofar as the sort of autonomy and preferential self-determination that it implies is incompatible with Catholic claims about human dependence on God, divine revelation, and the authority of the Church's teaching for human life, it is incompatible with Catholicism. Newman saw this clearly in his own time and place. It is no less true in ours, but its implications and valences are different, because the context for American Catholics in the early 21st century differs so much from what it was for English Catholics in the 19th, whether before or after the restoration of the Roman Catholic episcopate in 1850. What I'd like to do now, as I mentioned a moment ago, is to follow 4 different ways in which Newman saw expressions of a commitment to the autonomous sovereign self as the animating first principle of modernity. In each case, I'll say something about how a particular observation made by Newman remains applicable today. I will draw only on a few passages from his Discourses addressed to mixed congregations, published in 1849, and from his Idea of a University, first delivered in 1852. These could obviously be augmented with copious reference to many other relevant passages in Newman's published works, to say nothing of his voluminous correspondence. The 4 manifestations of the sovereign self I'm going to pursue are, first, the idea that individual human beings are their own masters and live for themselves. Secondly, that wealth and notoriety or celebrity are idolatrous substitutes for those who do not have God at the center of their lives. Third, that the answers about faith, meaning, and purpose given by the sovereign self are preferentially arbitrary. And finally, that modern higher education is fragmented and dominated by the utilitarian pursuit of the satisfaction of human desires in the absence of any coherent theological framework. I begin then with the idea that human beings are their own masters and live for themselves. In God's Will, the End of Life, the 6th of the Discourses addressed to mixed congregations, Newman contrasts what ought to be the orientation of any Christian's life, doing God's will in imitation of Christ, with what he discerns as the principle that in fact is guiding the actions and ambitions of most of his fellow citizens in England in the late 1840s. His description could well serve as the account of what Charles Taylor calls exclusive humanism in his book, A Secular Age, namely human life lived without reference to God or any sort of transcendence, considered as an end in itself within the immanent frame of the world. In response to the question, why were you sent into the world? Newman offers his characterization of the de facto widespread answer. The world professes to supply all that we need, as if we were sent into it for the sake of being sent here, and for nothing beyond the sending. There's no further purpose, no further point beyond what each person makes of his or her own life, beyond the meaning he or she gives to it. Every man is doing his own will here, seeking his own pleasure, pursuing his own ends, and that is why he was brought into existence. The contrast, of course, is with Christ, who came to do the will of his Father and did just that, and who bids Christians to do likewise insofar as they follow him. Despite overwhelmingly identifying as Christians of one sort or another, Newman's contemporaries had other priorities. Whether they went abroad in the streets to make direct observations or took up one of those daily prints and read about the same frenetic activity. The ways are thronged, carriageway and pavement. Multitudes are hurrying to and fro, each on his own errand, or have come forth into the public concourse to see and be seen for amusement or for display, or on the excuse of business. The carriages of the wealthy mingle with the slow wains laden with provisions or merchandise. The streets are lined with shops, open, inviting customers. Despite obvious differences in technology and surroundings, how different is this from what we observe today? Replace carriages with cars and wains with trucks, add suburban shopping malls to urban stores, and one might be describing the downtown of a large American city, say Pittsburgh, or a suburban center in 2014. So too, the range of global information, advertisements, commercial prospects, and curiosities instantly accessible online dwarfs what was accessible to Newman in the newspapers around 1850. But he conveys the same sense of overwhelming, flooded bewilderment at its sheer range. Look down the columns of advertisements and you will see the catalog of pursuits, projects, aims, anxieties, amusements, indulgences which occupy the mind of man. You will read of the money market and the provision market and the market for metals, of the state of trade, the call for manufactures, news of ships arrived in port, of accidents at sea, of exports and imports, of gains and losses, of frauds and their detection. What's the point of it all? Then or now? That's Newman's question. What is the telos? What is it all for? Newman registers his exasperation. Oh, this curious, restless, clamorous, panting being which we call life. And is there to be no end to all this? Is there no object in it? It never has an end. It is, forsooth, its own object. In other words, human life within the immanent frame sees no end beyond itself, then or now. From here, Newman moves on to a deeper, more focused characterization of the animating principle, the underlying commitment that explains all this bustle. His endeavor to penetrate into the hearts and to reach the ideas and the feelings of those who constitute it was insightful then, and it makes clear Newman's prescience in its abiding applicability. You will find them all to be living for the sake of living. They one and all seem to tell you, we are our own center, our own end. Why are they toiling? Why are they scheming? For what are they living? We live to please ourselves. Life is worthless except we have our own way. We are not sent here at all, but we find ourselves here. And we are but slaves unless we can think what we will, believe what we will, love what we will, hate what we will, do what we will. We detest interference on the part of God or man. We do not bargain to be rich or to be great, but we do bargain, whether rich or poor, high or low, to live for ourselves, to live for the lust of the moment, or, according to the doctrine of the hour, thinking of the future and the unseen just as much or as little as we please. Now, to me, it's difficult to imagine a more straightforward summary of the dominant American ideology of self-determining autonomy, the refusal to accept any direction or guidance except on one's own terms, to be the monarchical master of one's own existence. Mind your own business. Don't tread on me. Who are you to tell me what to do? The institutionalized individualism of American society today embodies deeply and emphatically what Newman discerned about the ethos of modernity as such. The counter-missiological notion of just finding ourselves here points ahead toward Heidegger's notion of Geworfenheit. That means thrownness, for those of you not up on your German. That was a pretentious way to put it, but the point is right. We are not sent here at all, Newman says. We find ourselves here, cast here, thrown here, dropped into existence, within which we endeavor to do whatever we want. According to Newman, living for oneself, by one's own standards, according to one's own will, and in defiance of any so-called outside interference, was by definition to reject the end that should order the priorities and the actions of any Christian, namely God's will, and not our own. Here Newman and, of all people, Nietzsche saw, I would contend, exactly the same thing, but they evaluated it in radically different ways. What Newman deplored, Nietzsche celebrated. But both saw more clearly than most 19th century thinkers the antithetical character of the relationship between Christianity and the sovereign modern self. Whether rejected or affirmed, it is a neo-Protagorean idea that man is the measure of all things, each self as the imagined mini-master of his or her own universe. I shift now to the second of the four expressions of the sovereign self, namely the manner in which Newman discusses wealth and celebrity, or notoriety, as forms of idolatry. In Saintliness, the Standard of Christian Principle, Newman writes insightfully about the rationality of human actions, understood, meaning here, intelligible behaviors that issue from men's and women's basic commitments. Notwithstanding claims to the contrary, people believe in something. They seek to live on principle, to live by rule, to profess a view of life, to have an aim, to set up a standard. For human beings cannot live altogether at random. He must, by the necessity of his nature, look up to something, and he creates, if he cannot discover, an object for his veneration. He teaches himself, or is taught by his neighbor, falsehoods, if he is not taught truth from above. He makes to himself idols if he knows not of the eternal God and his saints. Appealing to the tradition of common sense Lockean empiricism, in which Newman stands in certain respects, he invites his listeners and readers to look and see for themselves what they and their contemporaries are devoted to, what they prioritize, what their reason is directed towards. Look around, my brethren, and answer for yourselves. Contemplate the objects of this people's praise, survey their standards, ponder their ideas and judgment, and then tell me whether it is not most evident from their very notion of the desirable and the excellent that greatness and goodness and sanctity and sublimity and truth are unknown to them, and that they not only do not pursue, but do not even admire those high attributes of the divine nature. This is what I am insisting on. Not what they actually do or what they are, but what they revere, what they adore, what their gods are. What do people live for? What literally do they devote themselves to? What this basic exercise, looking around, discloses, Newman contends, is the extent to which a de facto idolatry of wealth pervades English society in the later 1840s. Their god is mammon. I do not mean to say that all seek to be wealthy, but that they all bow down before wealth. Wealth is that to which the multitude of men pay an instinctive homage. They measure happiness by wealth, and by wealth they measure respectability. Numbers, I say, there are who never dream that they shall ever be rich themselves, but who still, at the sight of wealth, feel an involuntary reverence and awe, just as if a rich man must be a good man. Theirs is a disinterested homage. It is an homage resulting from an honest, genuine, hearty admiration of wealth for its own sake. Such is that pure love which holy men feel for the maker of it all. It is an homage resulting from a profound faith in wealth, from the intimate sentiment of their hearts that, however a man may look, though he may be ignorant or diseased or feeble-minded, though he have the character of being a tyrant or a profligate, yet, if he be rich, he differs from all others. If he be rich, he has a gift, a spell, an omnipotence, that with wealth he may do all things. Certainly the propensity to be lured into the pursuit of wealth, despite the many clear admonitions against it in the New Testament, did not start in 19th century Britain. Abundant evidence of the same can be found among the 17th century Golden Age Dutch, Renaissance elites, and indeed those wealthy medieval popes before, during, and after the Avignonese papacy. that, as the great 20th century economic historian R.H. Tawney said, quote, preached renunciation and gave a lesson in greed. Wonderful phrase. I try to quote that phrase whenever I can, just so sweet. Preached renunciation and gave a lesson in greed. Newman at once comments on a particular moment in a long historical process, and he criticizes a temptation that I think transcends any particular era. Industrialization was transforming its implications in the 19th century, extending to a much broader social base the acquisitiveness that animated what Jan de Vries has called the Industrious Revolution. It also made possible the amassing of astonishing industrial fortunes in the 19th century. Before I say something about Newman's obvious relevance with respect to contemporary America as far as wealth is concerned, it's worth mentioning briefly the other widespread idol he mentions in the same address. Newman calls it notoriety, and in contrast to the idolatrous fixation of wealth, he regards it as distinctive of his own time because of the technological advances in transportation and communication. This is almost quaint given what we've been through since, right? But it's wonderful. Never could notoriety exist as it does now in any former age of the world. Now that the news of the hour from all parts of the world, private news as well as public, is brought day by day to every individual, as I may say, of the community, to the poorest artisan and to the most deluded peasant, by processes so uniform, so unvarying, so spontaneous, that they almost bear the semblance of a natural law. Notoriety, or the making of noise in the world, or as it may be called, newspaper fame, is like wealth, quote, worshipped for its own sake and without reference to the shape in which it comes before them. It may be an evil fame or a good fame. It matters not. So that a man is talked much of and read much of, he is thought much of. Now, what is noteworthy in the case of both wealth and notoriety, as Newman describes them, is the extent to which they have become ends in themselves, the object of devotion by large numbers of individuals disconnected from moral concerns. The objective of wealth is its power and aura per se, regardless of the use to which it is put or the moral character of the wealthy. And the point of notoriety is being noticed and noted, being famous and regarded, regardless of what it is that garners the attention. Oscar Wilde understood this too, not long after Newman's death. There's only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. The applicability of Newman's remarks to our own time again seems so obvious as to warrant little comment. Indeed, if anything, his words seem rather quaint by comparison to the world of networked, instantaneous communication via the internet and the countless billions of dollars that change hands every day in the pursuit of more wealth in the extraordinarily complex and fragile world of global financial markets. Mere newspaper fame has been superseded by several orders of magnitude when compared with websites and news stories that get millions of hits from online users via laptops and smartphones all around the world. Who knows which unpredictably quirky YouTube snippet will be the next to go viral? And who cares if it disappears as quickly as it appeared, since another equally random and inconsequential will arrive in its stead? Contemporary manifestations of notoriety, the sheer manufactured character of celebrity through spectacularly mislabeled reality TV, and the emergence of those who become famous for half-lives that make the proverbial 15 minutes about which Andy Warhol quipped seem long-lived by comparison, are all latter-day, technologically facilitated extensions of the notoriety that Newman identified as a pervasive idol in mid-19th century England. Our deeply rooted, all-encompassing pursuit of wealth today, in what James Twitchell has called our amoral consumerama, renders Newman's assessment of wealth as an idol rather tame by comparison. But it reinforces an appreciation for his prophetic prescience. In the United States today, in any case, the fact that the poorest households spend 9% of their income on lottery tickets suggests the extent to which those of meager means themselves do aspire to become wealthy, and by no means are content to admire the lifestyles of the rich and famous from a distance. They want it for themselves. They want lots of money so that they can buy lots of stuff, The nicer the better, and continually upgrade it whenever they want to, just like that tiny plutocratic proportion of the American population, less than 1%, that owns more than 40% of the country's wealth. We are dealing here, as Newman saw, with expressions of the autonomous sovereign self, multiplied many millions of times over, socially expressing acquisitive desires and preferences in ways that are both much more widespread and more deeply entrenched than a century and a half ago. So too, prophetic voices now are just as easily disregarded as his was then. The Occupy movement flashed and then flared out in raising objections to our socioeconomic realities and the moral injustices that sustain them and which they produce, including their effects on millions of poor laborers in other countries. Pope Francis seems less willing to let this particular idolatry alone. So one manifestation of the sovereign self is the commitment to a non-transcendent horizon for self-determined pursuits and pleasures, whatever they might be. A second is the extent to which human beings are enmeshed in the pursuit of wealth and live in societies obsessed with notoriety and celebrity. A third expression of the autonomous self on which Newman comments with perspicacity, related to the first two I've mentioned, is the preferential arbitrariness of beliefs and truth claims in the absence of Catholicism. The passage in question is drawn from near the end of Mysteries of Nature and of Grace. Newman begins with a provocative assertion. Turn away from the Catholic Church, and to whom will you go? It is your only chance of peace and assurance in this turbulent, changing world. Newman continues, his antecedent in this next sentence being the Catholic Church. There is nothing between it, the Catholic Church, and skepticism when men exert their reason freely. Private creeds, fancy religions may be showy and imposing to the many in their day. National religions may lie huge and lifeless and cumber the ground for centuries and distract the attention or confuse the judgment of the learned. But in the long run, it will be found that either the Catholic religion is verily and indeed the coming in of the unseen world into this, or that there is nothing positive, nothing dogmatic, nothing real in any of our notions as to whence we come and whither we are going. Unlearn Catholicism, and you open the way to your becoming Protestant, Unitarian, deist, pantheist, skeptic in a dreadful but inevitable succession. Only not inevitable by some accident of your position, of your education, and of your cast of mind. Only not inevitable if you dismiss the subject of religion from your view, deny yourself your reason, devote your thoughts to moral duties, or dissipate them in engagements of the world. This is both prophetic and historically suggestive of the basic trajectory of Western society since the Reformation. Let's allow for the idiosyncratic individual differences to which Newman rightly alludes and apply this passage to the evidence for what Western men and women have claimed was true in matters of religion, morality, and values since the early 16th century. It describes not a stadial process of one stage superseding another through which Western society as a whole passed between then and the mid-19th or the early 21st century, but rather it allows us to account for every Christian or post-Christian claim made about these domains of belief, values, and priorities between the early 16th century and the present. At no point in England since the Reformation, for example, or in Germany, France, or the Low Countries, or in England's North American colonies that became the United States, has there been a shared Christian or post-Christian view about what people should believe or how they should live. That is because, and this is what Newman saw so clearly, the corrosive criticism of skeptical rationalism applied to any faith claims that are merely preferential is bound to expose that arbitrariness and to lead one on, as it were, to yet another preferential and therefore no more stable position until the same process works itself out and ends in some form of skepticism itself. Yet the concrete, circumstantial particularities relevant in any given individual situation The fact that someone perhaps was brought up in a particular Protestant church in which strong social ties and moral values are instilled, for example, or the fact that someone else simply likes the non-dogmatic, emotionally soothing experiences instilled by some forms of romantic cum New Age pantheism, enable us to account for the obvious fact that not everyone has become a post-Christian rationalist skeptic. Newman's point, though, is that there is no good reason not to be a skeptic. Once one has cast off the deference to authority and the imperative of obedience that is the very heart of what the notion of substantive definitiveness in God's self-revelation implies. If there's no specifiable divine revelation and no authority outside oneself, one becomes one's own authority and believes whatever one pleases, as an expression of modernity's sovereign self. One ends with nothing but pragmatic assertions based on preferences and implicit but ultimately unjustifiable claims about one's own particular view of the good. Newman, of course, didn't live to see modernity become late modernity or post-modernity. I don't really think the terminology matters as long as it's clear what we're talking about. But this passage, the passage I just quoted from, has proven prophetic if we think of it with respect not only to secularization, but also to the collapse of philosophical foundationalism in recent decades. What Newman saw especially with respect to the application of skeptical reason to competing views of Christian and post-Christian religion also applies to the attempts from Descartes onward to answer on the basis of reason alone the sorts of questions about morality, meaning, and metaphysics that have been and still are answered by religious traditions, including Christianity. The Protestant Reformation's appeal to Scripture alone failed to provide a shared basis for consensual answers to these sorts of life questions without reference to authority or tradition. And now it is widely recognized that the Enlightenment's confidence in reason alone has similarly failed in the same objective. This failure of modern philosophical foundationalism has meant, in effect, a return of skepticism in postmodern forms after a long modern philosophical detour of more than 3 centuries. It has even meant a renewed turn toward religion among as unlikely a secular thinker as the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who recognizes the increasingly apparent weakness of modern liberalism per se, whether in its Kantian or Lockean lineages, in trying to justify the reality of categories central to its own discourse, human rights, persons, and human dignity, for example. Newman intuited the problem with which secular liberal theorists are now faced, trying to justify why anyone should believe that rights are any more real than souls, in a world in which the natural sciences demonstrate their cumulatively impressive power to explain reality at every level without recourse either to souls or to rights. Essentially, Newman's argument in this passage implies that either you embrace Catholicism, including the dogmas and authority that are simply correlative to the claim that Roman Catholicism preserves and develops the understanding of God's self-revelation to humanity as such, or if you are consistent and exercise your critical and skeptical reason without any restrictions, you will be forced to confront and to adopt Nietzsche's bold assertion in Twilight of the Idols. There are no moral facts whatsoever. Thankfully, most of those who reject Catholicism do not want to go there, and instead, inconsistently, cling to claims about rights, dignity, and morality of some kind. But as Newman foresaw, this is simply because of, quote, some accident of your position, of your education, and of your cast of mind. We now inhabit a society saturated with a soft Nietzscheanism, a moral culture that insists adamantly on human rights with all manner of rival claims about what they are, what their content is or should be, and an extension to individuals of the right to answer for themselves, to the greatest extent permissible, any and all questions about what is good, right, and true. In 1992, the U.S. Supreme Court made this quite explicit in its majority decision in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Here we see the explicit recognition and the legal protection of the autonomous sovereign self exercising its preferences, whatever they might be, with respect to matters of meaning, metaphysics, and morality. In short, Newman mapped out in 1849 what I referred to in my book, The Unintended Reformation, as the kingdom of whatever. We all live in it, whether we want to or not. It simply is the present-day sociocultural expression of political liberalism as it is actually playing itself out. Finally, I'd like to move from these passages about the modern sovereign self in the discourses addressed to mixed congregations to that same self and to higher education in Newman's idea of a university, the lectures for which were originally delivered in Dublin in 1852. I'm indebted here to an excellent recent article by Reinhard Hutter, University Education, the Unity of Knowledge, and Natural Theology, John Henry Newman's provocative vision. The manifestation of the sovereign self's will are less obvious, perhaps, in the idea of a university than in the discourses from which I've just quoted. But in a certain sense, Newman's comments are all the more remarkably prophetic insofar as he neither envisioned the Catholic University of Dublin as a research university in 1852, nor indeed did a research university even exist in England, whether at Oxford, Cambridge, or the new universities in Durham or London at the time. Oxford and Cambridge did not deconfessionalize and begin to adapt the model of the German Research University until the 1870s. In the same decade across the Atlantic, the same German model was differently adapted with the creation of the graduate school at American universities such as Johns Hopkins and Harvard. This makes all the more noteworthy Newman's remarks about individual preference in relationship to scientific accounts of human beliefs and actions that ignore theology. It is as though he foresaw what the impact of these guiding principles would eventually be on an institution with which he was not familiar and that in Britain and Ireland did not even exist at the time he made his remarks. Now that is being prophetic, more like soothsaying or inspired. In the second discourse of his idea of a university, Newman refers to a state of society such as ours, in which authority, prescription, tradition, habit, moral instinct, and the divine influence go for nothing, in which patience of thought and depth and consistency of view are scorned as subtle and scholastic, in which free discussion and fallible judgment are prized as the birthright of the individual. This matches, of course, his description of a society of autonomous individuals living for themselves, according to their own preferences, in his discourses addressed to mixed congregations. It seems especially applicable to higher education today. We are in the midst of a technologically facilitated transition from an emphasis on the careful reading of complex texts and the comprehension of demanding ideas to an emphasis on the ability to access large amounts of information and the quantitative analysis of big data for practical deliverables with quantifiable outcomes. I'm sure the students here would know nothing about what I'm talking about. According to Newman, higher education on this view results in the expression of antagonistic claims that arouse the extreme sensitiveness of large classes of the community, clergy and laymen, on the subjects of necessity, responsibility, the standard of morals, and the nature of virtue. Because technical education lacks the resources to address the resulting conflicts, the only way of avoiding constant quarreling in defense of this or that side of the question is, in the judgment of the persons I am supposing, to shut up the subject of anthropology altogether. This is accordingly done. Henceforth, man is to be as if he were not. In the general course of education, the moral and mental sciences are to have no professorial chairs, and the treatment of them is to be simply left as a matter of private judgment, which each individual may carry out as he will. The sorts of things that seem manifestly beyond any hope for resolution in academic discourse, in other words, are instead left to individual discretion, and universities pretend to be morally neutral institutions. In the words of political scientist John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, universities do not have a moral agenda and do not give students moral guidance, because that would involve preaching about values, and that is an enterprise that holds hardly any attraction for modern universities. Religious institutions and families are expected to provide their members with explicit advice about moral virtue, but universities are not. What actually happens, however, is a combination of alleged institutional moral neutrality combined with the importation of scholars' arbitrary moral preferences as a particular expression in higher education of the principles governing the sovereign self's preferences in the wider society. As Newman sees it, the individually determined preferences of the sovereign self replace any socially shared views about what is true, right, and good as part of a common religious tradition. This has consequences for higher education. In the institutional setting of a university, both the endless disagreements among practitioners of the humanities and the disintegration of the relationships among academic disciplines are corollaries of rejecting theology as an intellectually integrative endeavor. In Newman's words, "You will soon break up into fragments the whole of secular knowledge if you begin the mutilation of the divine." This was an acute prognostication about the ubiquitous specialization and the disciplinary fragmentation characteristic of research universities since the late 19th century, never more apparent than today. There's every reason to think Newman would have agreed with Alistair MacIntyre's argument that we really ought not to speak of universities any longer, because in no meaningful sense do they offer or seek to offer any coherent picture of the universe. That he would have approved of, as more accurate of the term multiversity coined by Clark Kerr over 50 years ago. And indeed that he would have understood very well Reinhard Hutter's critical epithet, polytechnic utiliversity, as the best term suited to replace the now obsolete misnomer university. Having banished any discipline that is conceptually capable of relating different sorts of knowledge to one another, and with the humanities and social sciences at least marginalized because of their importation of arbitrary individual preferences from the wider society, it is the natural sciences that move into the space vacated by theology and attempt to replace the integration of knowledge with reductionist explanation. In the early 1850s, this was largely a matter of a Newtonian mechanistic causality, with human exploits, human devices, human needs, human productions, all explained with reference to their place in the eternal system of physical cause and effect, the final aim being to show how the whole fabric of material civilization has arisen from the constructive powers of physical elements and physical laws. That's Newman. Today, the dominant reductionism, of course, comes not from physics, but from biology, in the form of neo-Darwinism, with evolutionary theory extolled in disciplines from neuroscientific psychology to social anthropology, as the supposed key to explaining everything about human culture, social relationships, beliefs, desires, and behavior. But the modern natural sciences are not only about discovery and understanding. They are also about utility and application. What are they useful for? Whatever human beings, or more accurately, those human beings with the knowledge, means, and power, decide they want to use them for. Here, the individual autonomy of the sovereign self is already beginning to meet the technical know-how of human eugenics in ways that Newman could not have foreseen, of course, and by which he certainly would have been appalled, if not perhaps surprised. For his apprehension about what a university might become in the absence of theology as the necessary integrative discipline, the combination of alleged value neutrality with the intrusion of arbitrariness about matters of morality and value into the humanities and social sciences, and the imperialistic reductionism of the natural sciences point in this direction, even if no one in the 19th century, of course, could have foreseen the specific biotechnological possibilities that confront us now. I will be brief by way of conclusion. As much as things have changed since the mid-19th century, and as a historian, I would be the last to disavow how much the world has been transformed in the past century and a half. What hasn't changed are the dominant conceptions of and commitments to the sovereign individual self and the maximization of its choices, the facilitation of its preferential pursuits, and the fulfillment of its desires as the cornerstone of what Western modernity is and what Western postmodernity remains. John Henry Newman saw this in the 1840s. It remains no less the case now, and that is why, as a social observer and a cultural critic, he should be regarded as the prophetic Newman. He thought he was living in difficult, threatening times. I think we are too. But just as Newman sought to use his reason as a handmaiden to hope in criticizing those aspects of modernity antithetical to the truth, so do I think, in our own way and for our own times, we should seek to do likewise. And so in this way, too, Newman has not only influenced me, but also in some small way inspired me to follow his example. Thank you. I guess there's time for some questions. If people have questions, I'd be happy to take ones.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. You really did capture Newman. I did find myself thinking, how does one reconcile the true Catholic and Christian belief that we're called to become our best selves? We're called to become, fully alive and true to ourselves. And when does that cross the line into this individualism that you described that is not such a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think there's a short way to answer that question, and there's probably a very complicated long way. So I'll just go for the short one. I think it's a particular misnomer of Western modernity to think there is some kind of a conflict or an irreconcilable difference between the way in which, properly understood, Christians being called to become the person that God wants them to be is somehow in conflict with genuine individualism. I mean, the sort of individualism means do whatever you want without regard for, an understanding of the human person, the character of the sorts of creatures that we are, and so forth, is a very different notion of what it means to be an individual than the notion of, developing into the man or woman that God intends for you to be. So I think you could talk about it in the context of a healthy or a robust or a genuine individualism on the one hand versus a kind of twisted or, I think, self-absorbed individualism on the other. The profound difficulty, it seems to me, is that what we have institutionalized is the latter. And we have institutionalized the latter, we have it institutionalized not in the sense that everybody is required to be that way. We all know examples of people who, to various degrees, right, are very much living the other way. But we do it within a context, and this is what I mean by we all live in the kingdom of whatever, regardless of whether we want to or not. We're surrounded by people who don't choose to live in that way, and I would argue that the dominant ethos in really quite influential ways tends in this direction. I mean, in other words, if you try to argue this towards somebody, right, what are you going to get? You're going to get, right, mind your own business, who are you to tell me what to do, right, don't tread on me, you do what you do, I'll do what I do. And that's what we have. And we have that for historical reasons. I mean, that's really, why we have that is basically what my book is about. Not that I'm pumping for more sales, but in any case. Anyway, I'm veering into a long rather than a short answer to your question, Catherine. But anyway, thank you very much for it. Yes?
These things overlap. The presence of process theology within the church, within those institutions within the church, I think give way to cooperating with this misunderstanding of the modern age. The fact that there's no truth that's, that basically the church is historical.
Not you.
and supernatural. Yeah. And that's what's been confused in the idea that there is no objective truth. And I know back in college, I wasted 4 years. If I had gone to a Catholic university that was really Catholic, I would have made a lot more advanced. But one sociologist said, we either do we discover or create meaning? Yeah. And that's the fundamental thing. Is there something objective? That's basically what
Newman's saying, right? That's the point he's making here about idolatry. If you don't discover the truth, you invent a false God.
Right.
There really are no other alternatives.
Right.
And the most common counter-argument to that is the claim that, well, you people that think there is an objective truth, right, you're the ones who are deluded. We all are, in fact, constructing our respective competing, right, priorities and so forth, of which yours is just another one. That's what the retort will be.
Bill Moyer said that to Adler in an interview. Said, well, that's your truth, this is my truth.
Precise,
and
yeah.
Adler said, we have nothing to discuss.
Yeah, well, I mean, sadly, I think that's the case. Now, I think there are strategies that one can try to, I don't think that's necessarily the end of the discussion. I hate to leave somebody just, that's your view, that's mine. I want to reach them. That's my, right, intellectual's attempt at evangelization. Because I don't think really there are people who truly, when push comes to shove, think that. I do think people really think there are absolutes. I've not met somebody, right, who's willing to defend, for example, the permissibility of genocide under certain circumstances. Or who thinks, in some cases it's okay to torture children, if that's your thing.
I would defend Adler.
Right?
If that is true, but it isn't. So
yeah, that's right. And so that means that, right, and once you see, it really would have to be a pathologically amoral, creature of a human being to hold those sorts of things. I've never met anybody like that, thank goodness. If somebody will admit, right, that, of course, I don't mean that, that's outrageous, that is absolutely beyond the pale, then you, in a certain sense, at least you have a basis for a discussion. Why is that the case? Why do we recoil at the notion, right, of 12-year-old girls being sold into sexual slavery? That is absolutely wrong, impermissible. I don't care what your moral framework is, that is wrong.
Right,
if you think that...
Reductio ad absurdum.
Yeah, well, it's just to get them to realize they themselves are not the sorts of, hey, your view, my view. No, we do share some things in common, at least so far. I'm not making predictions for 50 or 100 years from now. I mean, I tend to be something of a cultural pessimist, partly because it seems to me the trajectories are very powerfully in a certain direction. Doesn't mean it can't be changed, doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do the right thing, but, it's naive to think that things that have been in motion for very long periods of time are deeply entrenched, right, are politically protected, are constantly, right, being reinforced through patterns that we ourselves in respective ways participate in. I mean, I'm talking here, I have allusions in here to the socioeconomic injustices perpetuated by the kind of, world system of capitalism that we made. I mean, I don't know, but I'll bet you anything, none of the clothes on my body were made by people who were making a living wage. And I bet that's the case for most of us sitting here. We don't, we're in it. We're in it. You can't stand apart from it completely. I know. It's a drag. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. Go ahead, yeah.
So I don't want to exactly disagree, but I...
You can. It's fine.
Very nervously disagree. It's going to be a basic deal form here. But my experience is not so much of the people who are saying there is no objective truth, but it seems to become actually a bit archaic right now. The world that I feel like I live in is the one best described by Slavoj Žižek, the Christian atheist. Right? These are the people who have a belief in God who have faith in God without belief. He likens it to a ghost, right? When I believe in ghosts, but have faith in ghosts, it's just the opposite. And so I think that we actually have a situation in which people, a lot of people who are not in universities, who are not in the media, things like that, who do have this kind of rock solid faith that in actuality is functioning the way you described, who think that they have this metaphysical and ontological bedrock. In fact, they don't. And so I'm wondering, is that a problem for comparing our age to, first of all, is there anything that's true? And is there a way to look at Newman's time and see this kind of work as well?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I agree with you. I mean, and this is, I think it's consistent with what I said, although I didn't draw it out in the talk, that I'm averse to descriptions of historical change that regard somehow, at once upon a time people were all this way, then they all became this way, and now we're all this way. And my empirical evidence for that is simply that we're not all the same way now. I mean, it's pretty, but there really are serious implications about that for, say, the way one discusses or understands secularization, for example. When you've got a world that's, teeming with traditional forms of religiosity, you can't really do that. But your point, I think, is a good one. And I think that particular sensibility, you can find it, I mean, it's certainly also here in the United States, I think among certain academics, so people that are highly educated. It's more prevalent, I think, in Western Europe. Because I think that's, this is something like what the British sociologist Grace Davy calls, right, believing without belonging. That people, it's not the case that Europeans have, completely, in other words, they haven't, Newman would say they haven't been consistent yet. He would say, right, that this is in a certain sense a transitional phase. If he's right, it's a transitional phase, right? In the long run, especially once if we start to see, I think, the possibilities of biotechnology wedded to people with the economic means and the political laws that enable them to do all kinds of stuff, who knows what's going to go on weird offshore nations and so forth. Who knows? I mean, who knows? We're not there yet. But I agree with you, and thank God for it, that people who claim not to believe in God still think absolutely there are human rights and absolutely we should treat people decently. And, I think, hey, believing, serious religious believers, Catholics, non-Catholics, should make common cause with and advance that as much as possible. Wherever you see goodness and truth in the world, embrace it, make common cause with it, try to draw people in and so forth and so on. And I mean, I've made the point before with respect to things like the way in which, the social net in, radically godless countries like France, for example, the way they take care of their citizens, to me, looks and feels a lot more Christian than the way in which Americans, let tens of millions of people fend for themselves with respect. So, you see, these things are complicated.
That's the danger that I would love to see Newman's insight on, is in America, we have these people who profess faith,
exactly,
like Europeans do not.
Yeah.
Profess faith and say, I believe X, Y, and Z. Yeah. But in terms of function, they don't. Well, they have no faith and have no ontological.
Exactly.
So what does Newman, how do you deal with somebody who would say, I have the other sense. I have this thing that starts within me that allows me to move forward in a way that's not just a construction of my own, but in fact that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, and I was talking with John earlier today about, and maybe this is where, the difference, but Newman maybe, and there are people here who know Newman so much better than I, so please chime in and let me know where I'm way off base. I mean, to me, he's more an inspirational figure than he's not my, because, for me, I have so much respect for him that I thought, if I'm really going to do this guy seriously, I'm going to have to devote all my time to him, and I'm already doing other stuff, so I'll just take what I can take from him. But I think maybe Newman would talk about that difference between those who profess but don't, their actions and their way of living doesn't match it, versus those who say, I don't believe, but in fact they're acting in ethically, seriously, de facto religious ways. Maybe there's a difference between notional and real assent. I mean, notional assent is, I go to church every year, yes, I believe Jesus is my Savior, right, but no, impact on the rest. As opposed to, one of my mentors, for example, he's, self-proclaimed atheistic Jew, grew up in Brooklyn, taught by people, as he said, who had numbers burned into their arms from the death camps, I don't believe in God at all. Probably the most ethical person I ever met. Absolutely rock solid sense. He knows what's right and what's wrong. And the fact that he hasn't gone to synagogue in, many years, neither here nor there. Those are realities, right? I'm pretty much with Flannery O'Connor, on this one, as in so many things. Almost always got it, not just right, but bullseye, right? Almost the only way we really know what we believe is by what we do. That's sobering. At least for me it is. Me personally, Yeah.
It's also interesting, historically, that in dealing with all of this, these things that we saw in the wider world, that there's been a recent book on this, that Newman, in his own direct family circle, had experience of, the way things disintegrate in this way. I'm particularly thinking about his brother Frank, who started out sort of a similar fervent evangelical type, and through his deficient first principle, basically degenerated into a complete, basically a skeptic, oddly enough, a skeptic who also had he had lots of particular things that he thought were morally important and needed to be morally improved, but they were so wrong that in the end, Frank was actually he actually publicly, I believe was advocating for euthanasia in like the 1880s. Yeah. So it's like he not only saw this in the wider culture, but was impacted by it.
Him personally, in his own.
Direct,
I think that's a very good point, and one always, not only with respect to Newman, but I think anyone who sees and experiences in a very close, concrete, personal way, exemplifications of wider societal trends is bound to be certainly reinforced, and those are very powerful things. So, yeah, of course.
Really very fast. When you talk about the autonomous individual, I mean, we can see that all over in the culture. But it seems like there's another aspect of the culture. There's a lot of conformity. I mean, I think of HHS mandate, same-sex marriage. I mean, I'd be interested to know your analysis, or maybe Newman's idea historically. I mean, it's almost like a contradiction. I mean, yeah, of course, the autonomous individual, but in so many ways, it's anti-individual in a way.
Yeah. Well, and the great theorist of this, the one who was so very penetrating about it with respect to the United States so early on, is Tocqueville. I mean, he talks about exactly this kind of weird paradox about democratic societies. For him, that's the category. He comes to the U.S., he comes out of France, where, you've got these kind of bring back the monarchy royalists versus these Republicans, anti-clericalists. They're at loggerheads. And he says, here in the United States, right, people can believe whatever they want to. Right? It's this land of individualism. But what do people do? They conform, right? There's a kind of strange sense in which to exercise your individuality is also tempered by, influenced by, looking around and seeing what others are doing. So that, and this is something too I liked to point out, not really in mean professor mode, but just sort of be attentive students mode. And students are all talking about, they're, how they're this or that's my own thing, or this is, I'm finding this, whatever, and they're all sort of struck by, and one student said, this was a few years ago, so maybe it's less so with Facebook kind of on the wane, or I'm told it is. I've never had a Facebook account. They said, but we all have Facebook accounts. And we all have, we all dress the same way. And they're looking around kind of like, we're all sort of more or less, living the same kinds of lives, notwithstanding, the kind of openness to, in principle, an enormous wide range of different things. Maybe I think to think about that and theorize it properly would take more work than I've done. But I think you're exactly right about that. The heterogeneity, I think, the individualism that matters in terms of its social disruptiveness are the things about crucial, really central moral issues. Things like the definition of what is a family, what is a marriage, who is a person. That's what really, these are the questions that lie behind, abortion, right, same-sex marriage, adoption, these questions and so forth. Those are the real underlying questions. And it seems to me that, a society that really fundamentally can't agree about those sort of things is a deeply troubled society. Deeply troubled simply in terms of how we get on with one another and so forth. Because looking into the future, it seems to me either we can anticipate a continuation of the sort of, really unpleasant and also unsatisfying political culture that's little more than, my bumper sticker says this and yours says not this. Really, political discourse in this country is dire. It's bad. Either we have a perpetuation of that, or we have a situation in which the combination of the courts, the Congress, and the president basically step in and they say, well, we're ending this one, and here's where it ends. And so it seems to me that when you have a society deeply riven by differences like this, what you get is an expression of the democratic liberal state that basically, under the guise of insisting how free we are, in fact starts acting more and more oppressively and tyrannically. It seems to me that's the more likely trajectory. And so then the people who really take a principled stand against it have to make hard choices. You know, are you willing to do jail time, for example, over your commitment to what you understand a family to be, or what you understand a person to be? So, anyway.
So I will just make a
comment.
Please. So so I heard a lecture earlier this week given by the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who spoke on much the same theme. And his concluding remark was, this was given at a religious institution. I was here a year ago and said we may find ourselves in jail together. Now I'll say we may find ourselves in jail together sooner than we thought. Yeah. So, but the point I want to make regarding your talk, which I really appreciated, I thought it was so wonderful. But your third point about the truth,
Yeah.
reject the truth claims of Catholicism, and we head down this road. And I'm not sure that a century plus later that is the conclusion I would reach, because actually I see more not just Catholicism against the world, but those who believe in transcendence, those who believe in that there is a God, that there is an objective truth, that there are standards that apply, that we didn't just make these up, but that there are standards. To me, those are the ones we are the ones who need to make common cause. And there's a lot more that we share as religious people that separates us in this regard.
Yes, I'm very glad you made that point. I was hoping actually somebody would make the point, because in the earlier draft of this talk, I had to cut it down a bit because it was already getting a bit lengthy. And so one of the passages that I cut, though, was actually a kind of a side comment about Newman's point on this, saying that here I think we have to understand what Newman's saying, very specifically contextual. Mixed congregations for him means some Catholics and some Anglicans. And so it's a kind of warning specifically to them. But in fact, I think, and originally I had said, I think here, not only does it have to be extended further in an inter-Christian context, but also with respect to other religious traditions. I mean, I know plenty of Jews and Muslims who are not, anxiety-ridden and wondering and waiting for some, shred or sliver of meaning to come into their lives. And I agree with you completely. This is, I would say, again, one of the important differences between the context in which Newman is writing, right, in England, in this essentially only intra-Christian context and primarily an Anglican Catholic dynamic, to the extraordinarily complicated, pluriform, constantly shifting context that we find ourselves in which it does seem to me that one of the basic and really consequential fault lines is this one, the one that you just put your finger on. Does somebody think that are there objective truths, transcendent meanings? Do we discover truth, or everybody just makes it? They make it for themselves, and in the public sphere we wrestle it out, and that's what we call politics. So, there really is. I agree with you. I agree. Anyway, thanks very much.